The sun rises on May 29, 1453. The sky bleeds gold over the ancient waters separating two worlds. And in that crimson dawn, one man's choice will bring a 1,000-year-old empire crashing to its knees. His name, Giovanni Giustiniani, a mercenary commander, a warrior legend, and the man history would forever accuse of the ultimate betrayal. But here's the question nobody asks. Did he truly betray Constantinople, or did he simply do what any human would when pushed beyond their breaking point? The real answer is buried beneath the smoking ruins of history's most legendary city, written in the blood of the last Roman emperor who refused to run. This is the untold story of how the world's greatest fortress didn't fall to cannons or courage alone. It collapsed because of one soldier's wound, one instant of panic, and one retreat that changed human civilization forever. And by the time this video ends, you'll see exactly how a single injury ripped open the gates to an empire that had stood since the time of Jesus Christ himself. Let's rewind. The year is 1453, and the world is balancing on a razor's edge. Empires are teetering, power is shifting. And in the east, there's a young, hungry sultan with fire in his eyes. His name is Mehmed, and he's got his gaze locked on the ultimate trophy, Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the last living piece of ancient Rome, the bridge between continents, cultures, and civilizations. And by this point in history, it's gasping its last breath. Once upon a time, Constantinople was unstoppable. 500,000 people called it home. Its harbors overflowed with treasures from across the known world. Gold, silk, spices, you name it. Its palaces glittered like something out of a fever dream. And those walls, legendary. Army after army had broken themselves against those stones, earning the city its reputation as the fortress no one could crack. But that golden age long gone. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had withered into a shadow of itself. The sprawling territories that once reached from Italy to the Caucasus had shriveled down to basically just the city and a few forgotten outposts. Where vibrant neighborhoods once thrived, now there were just empty fields trapped inside those massive walls. The population had collapsed to maybe 50,000 souls rattling around in a city designed for 10 times that many. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos knew the clock was ticking. Every single morning, he'd walk the battlements of those legendary Theodosian Walls and see the cracks, not just in the stone, but in the very soul of his dying empire. His treasury, almost empty. His army, barely 7,000 men. His navy, a pathetic 26 ships, most of them owned by Italian merchants who didn't owe him anything. And yet, Constantine refused to abandon ship. When Mehmed's messengers came offering him a cushy retirement and safe passage in exchange for surrender, the emperor's answer was ice-cold defiance. Constantinople had never fallen to a siege, and by the grace of God, it never would. But you can't stop destiny with defiance alone. Not when what's marching toward you from the east is a storm unlike anything the world has ever seen. Sultan Mehmed II was only 21 years old, but his mind worked like a chess grandmaster who saw 20 moves ahead. Where his father and grandfather had tried and failed to conquer Constantinople, he would succeed. This wasn't just ambition, it was his calling. In his head, he wasn't just another warlord chasing gold and glory. No, he was the heir to Caesar, the rightful inheritor of the Roman Empire itself. And every night in his tent, he sat sketching the walls of Constantinople, plotting exactly where his cannons would punch through stone that had stood for centuries. Mehmed's preparation was surgical. First, he locked down peace treaties with Hungary and Venice, making absolutely sure no rescue would come for Constantine from the north or west. Then he built the fortress of Rumeli Hisari at the narrowest choke point of the Bosphorus, effectively strangling Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea. But his masterstroke, he hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban to forge him the biggest, baddest cannons the medieval world had ever laid eyes on. Here's the tragic irony: Urban tried to sell his services to the Byzantines first. Imagine that. The very weapon that would smash Constantinople's ancient walls to rubble could have saved the city if only Emperor Constantine had the gold to pay for it. But the imperial vaults were empty. So Urban took his blueprints to Mehmed, who paid him a king's ransom. And just like that, Constantinople's doom was sealed by an empty treasury. The cannon Urban built was nothing short of a medieval monster, 27 feet of bronze and iron fury, a barrel more than 2 feet across, capable of hurling stone cannonballs weighing over 1,300 pounds more than a mile through the air. When Urban test-fired this beast outside the Ottoman capital of Edirne, the roar shattered windows and sent pregnant women into early labor. Mehmed watched with a predator's smile. When he asked Urban if this thing could breach Constantinople's walls, the engineer didn't hesitate. Not only will it tear through the Theodosian Walls, he bragged, it could turn the walls of Babylon itself into dust. But cannons alone don't take cities. Mehmed assembled the largest army the Ottomans had ever fielded, somewhere between 80,000 and 160,000 men depending on who you ask. At the heart of this war machine were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite warriors. These weren't your average soldiers. They were boys taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and raised from childhood to be perfect killers. They knew no loyalty except to the Sultan. no fear except disappointing him. They were disciplined, fanatical, and absolutely lethal. Backing up the Janissaries were waves of regular troops from every corner of the Ottoman Empire. Anatolian infantry with curved swords and composite bows. Irregular bashibazouks, expendable cannon fodder whose job was to wear down the defenders before the real fight began. Lightning-fast cavalry, engineers for the siege equipment, miners to tunnel under the walls. And towering over it all, Urban's monstrous cannon and dozens of smaller guns that would pound Constantinople's defenses around the clock. As winter melted into spring in 1453, this enormous host began its march toward the city. Villages emptied as the army approached. Peasants fled into forests or sailed across the water, spreading tales of an endless ocean of tents and banners stretching to the horizon. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of so many marching boots inside Constantinople. Constantine knew the hammer was about to fall. He sent frantic letters to every Christian kingdom in the West, begging for help against the Muslim tide. The response, soul-crushing indifference. Hungary had its own problems and told him to deal with it. Venice sent polite words but no ships. The Pope. He saw the whole crisis as leverage to force the Orthodox Church to bend the knee to Rome, demanding religious unity as the price tag for any aid. Even when the Orthodox clergy grudgingly agreed, the people of Constantinople rioted in the streets, screaming that they'd rather see the Sultan's turban in their city than the Pope's crown. But as Mehmed's army closed in, a few brave souls did answer the call. From Genoa came a ship carrying 700 men under the command of a mercenary captain named Giovanni Giustiniani. This man, this soldier of fortune, would become the pivotal figure in our entire story, the one whose actions would determine whether Constantinople lived or died. So who was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, and why did Constantine bet everything on him? Born into a noble Genoese family around 1418, Giovanni was a younger son with no inheritance waiting for him back home. So he chose the mercenary life, selling his sword to the highest bidder. By the time he stepped foot in Constantinople, he was 35 years old and had built a reputation as one of Europe's deadliest siege specialists. He defended walled cities before and knew every trick, every tactic, every desperate move. When Emperor Constantine saw this battle-scarred warrior disembark with 400 seasoned fighters, it must have felt like the first ray of hope in months. Constantine immediately made Giustiniani commander of the land defenses and put him in charge of the most vulnerable stretch of wall. It was a desperate gamble, trusting the fate of his empire to a foreign mercenary whose real loyalty was to gold, not God or country. But Constantine had no choice. His own generals were few, and his soldiers had little experience with siege warfare. If anyone could hold those walls against Mehmed's onslaught, it was this grizzled Genoese captain. Yet even as Giustiniani organized the defenses and inspired the garrison with his confidence, a dark question lingered. What would happen when the real test came? When the Ottoman cannons started tearing the walls apart and the Janissaries launched their final assault, would this mercenary stand his ground? Or would he calculate that his contract didn't include dying for a lost cause? The stage was set, and the answer would soon come in the most dramatic way imaginable. On April 5, 1453, the horizon outside Constantinople turned black. Like a nightmare made flesh, Mehmed's vast army rolled across the hills and valleys surrounding the city. Banners rippled in the spring wind, thousands upon thousands bearing the crescents and stars of the Ottoman Empire. The thunder of war drums echoed off ancient stone as regiment after regiment took position. The siege had begun. Giustiniani stood atop the outer wall, his calloused hands gripping the battlements as he took in the enemy host. Even for a veteran of countless campaigns, the sight was staggering. Endless rows of tents stretched toward the horizon, glinting with armor and steel. Smoke rose from 100 cooking fires. The sound of hammering filled the air as engineers assembled their siege machines. And there, being dragged slowly into position by teams of oxen and hundreds of men, was Urban's monstrous cannon. The Genoese captain had seen many armies, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a military force, it was an entire civilization on the move. Mehmed had brought craftsmen to build his siege works, miners to burrow under the walls, sailors to blockade the harbor, and administrators to run the city once it fell. This young sultan wasn't planning a raid or a show of force. He was planning total conquest, and he'd brought everything necessary to achieve it. Constantine joined Giustiniani on the walls, and the two men stood in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they faced. The emperor's face was gaunt with exhaustion, but his voice stayed firm. 7,000 men against more than 100,000. Impossible odds, but these walls have held against impossible odds before. They'll hold again, God willing. Giustiniani nodded, though privately he was running cold calculations. He'd seen what modern artillery could do to medieval stone. The Theodosian Walls were magnificent, sure, but they'd been built in an age of catapults, not cannons that could hurl massive rocks with bone-shattering force. Still, he'd taken Constantine's gold and given his word. He'd hold the walls or die trying. The bombardment opened on April 12th with a roar that shook the very bones of the earth. Urban's great cannon spoke first, a thunderclap that echoed across the Bosphorus and could be heard for miles. The massive stone ball struck the outer wall with catastrophic force, sending chunks of masonry flying and leaving a crater in stone that had stood for 1,000 years. Smaller cannons joined the symphony, their shots hammering the walls in a relentless rhythm that would continue for weeks. Inside the city, civilians huddled in terror as the bombardment raged. Every impact sent tremors through the ground, rattling windows and making buildings sway. Children sobbed while their parents whispered desperate prayers. The constant noise was almost as devastating as the physical damage, grinding down nerves and making sleep a distant memory. But the Byzantines weren't sitting ducks. Every night, as soon as darkness fell, repair crews poured out of the city to work frantically on the shattered walls. They hauled stones and timber through rubble-choked streets, mixing mortar by torchlight and racing the clock to rebuild defenses before dawn brought the cannons back to life. Giustiniani was everywhere during these night repairs, encouraging workers, directing reinforcements, and slowly earning the loyalty and respect of Constantine's soldiers. The Genoese captain proved himself a defensive genius. When sections of the outer wall were blown apart by Ottoman guns, he built earthworks and wooden barriers behind them, creating new defensive lines that were actually harder to assault than the original fortifications. When Urban's monster cannon blasted a massive breach near the gate of St. Romanos, Giustiniani personally led crews to construct a crescent-shaped rampart that turned the gap into a killing zone for any attacker brave enough to enter. Day after grinding day, the pattern continued. Ottoman cannons would pulverize the walls during daylight while Byzantine repair crews worked through the night to undo the damage. It was a race between destruction and reconstruction, with the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. The defenders were bone-tired, running on almost no sleep and dwindling supplies, but somehow they held on. Giustiniani's presence seemed to give them strength. His calm confidence was infectious even in the face of overwhelming odds. Mehmed grew increasingly frustrated as the days bled into weeks. His cannons were doing catastrophic damage, but the defenders kept patching the walls faster than he could knock them down. The massive breach near the gate of St. Romanos should have been the key to victory, yet Giustiniani had turned it into a fortress within a fortress. Worse, Urban's giant cannon was proving as much a liability as an asset. The tremendous forces involved in firing it caused cracks in the barrel, and after weeks of constant use, the monster weapon finally burst during firing, killing Urban and several assistants. But Mehmed was nothing if not adaptable. If he couldn't batter the walls down fast enough, he'd find other ways in. His engineers started digging tunnels beneath the fortifications, planning to plant explosives that would bring down entire sections at once. His navy launched attacks on the harbor defenses, trying to break the chain protecting the Golden Horn. He even managed to drag ships overland on greased logs to bypass the harbor barriers, a feat of engineering that stunned both sides. Each of these tactics was met and countered by the defenders. Giustiniani organized countermining operations, sending his own diggers to intercept Ottoman tunnels. Constantine's few remaining ships, reinforced by Italian vessels, fought desperately to keep the harbor open. When Mehmed succeeded in getting part of his fleet into the Golden Horn, the Byzantines stretched a pontoon bridge across the water and used it to launch surprise attacks on Ottoman ships. As April turned to May, both sides were reaching their breaking points. The Ottoman army had been camped outside Constantinople for nearly 2 months, and disease was spreading through the ranks. Supply lines stretching hundreds of miles were becoming harder to maintain. Some of Mehmed's advisors began whispering that maybe it was time to lift the siege and try again next year, but Mehmed had staked everything on this campaign. To withdraw now would look like weakness, an invitation for enemies, both foreign and domestic, to move against him. More than that, he could sense the defenders were cracking. Intelligence reports spoke of mounting desperation inside the city, of food shortages and collapsing morale. The walls might look solid from a distance, but he knew they'd been patched and repatched so many times they were held together more by sheer will than mortar. The young Sultan made his choice. One final, overwhelming assault would shatter the defender's spirit and hand him the prize he'd dreamed of since childhood. He would throw everything, every man, every weapon, every ounce of strength at those walls in a coordinated attack that would begin before dawn and continue until either Constantinople fell or his army was annihilated trying. As May 28th turned to May 29th, neither Mehmed nor Constantine slept. The Ottoman camp buzzed with activity, weapons sharpened, armor checked, assault ladders prepared, and the surviving cannons loaded for one last barrage. In the city, Giustiniani made his final rounds of the defenses, speaking quietly with his men and ensuring every section of wall was properly manned. The Genoese captain had fought in many sieges, but he'd never felt responsibility weigh this heavily. The fate of the last remnant of Rome rested on his shoulders, and those of a few thousand exhausted men under his command. In a few hours, when the Ottoman storm broke, Every decision he made could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. What neither Giustiniani nor anyone else in Constantinople could have known was that this night would test more than military skill and courage. It would expose the true nature of loyalty itself, and the razor-thin line separating heroism from betrayal. The greatest siege in medieval history was about to reach its climax, and at its heart lay a question that would haunt the centuries to come. As the first pale fingers of dawn reached over Constantinople's walls on May 29th, the silence shattered with the deep rumble of Ottoman war drums. The sound rolled across the hills like an earthquake, joined by the haunting wail of horns and the battle cries of thousands of warriors preparing for what they knew would be the final throw of the dice. In the distance, Mehmed's banner snapped in the morning wind, and the young sultan himself sat mounted on his warhorse, eyes fixed on the city that had defied him for 55 days. Giovanni Giustiniani stood at his post near the gate of St. Romanos, the section of wall that had absorbed the worst punishment from Ottoman artillery. His armor was scarred and dented from weeks of combat, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who hadn't truly slept in months. Around him, his Genoese soldiers checked their weapons one last time, faces grim but resolute. These men had followed their captain across half of Europe. They'd follow him into hell if he asked. The attack opened with a human wave of bashibazoks, the irregular troops Mehmed used as expendable shock forces. They came screaming across the rubble-strewn no-man's land between the Ottoman lines and the walls, carrying crude weapons and makeshift shields. Their job wasn't to take the city, it was to exhaust the defenders and drain their ammunition. Wave after wave of these doomed souls hurled themselves at the Byzantine defenses, only to be mowed down by arrows, crossbow bolts, and occasional bursts of Greek fire. For 2 brutal hours, the slaughter continued. The ground before the walls became a carpet of corpses as the bashibazoks pressed their hopeless assault, but Giustiniani could see the method in Mehmed's seeming madness. Each wave forced the defenders to burn through precious arrows and bolts. Each attack wore down men who were already running on fumes. The Genoese captain conserved his strength and that of his troops as much as possible, knowing the real test was still coming. As the sun climbed higher, the second wave began. These were professional soldiers, Anatolian troops with proper armor and training. They advanced in disciplined formations, shields locked together as they approached the walls. Behind them came siege ladders and portable bridges designed to get them over or through the Byzantine defenses. The fighting intensified, became more savage. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the ramparts as Ottoman soldiers managed to scale the walls, only to be met by Giustiniani's men with sword and axe. The Genoese captain seemed to be everywhere at once. When a section of wall looked ready to collapse, he appeared with reinforcements. When his men's courage began to falter, his voice cut through the chaos, steadying nerves and reminding them of their duty. He fought like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling in deadly rhythm, his presence alone worth 100 ordinary fighters. But even Giustiniani couldn't be in all places at once. And slowly, inevitably, the Ottoman pressure began to tell. Sections of the outer wall that had been patched and repatched started crumbling under the weight of the assault. Defenders fell struck by arrows or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Byzantines were fighting magnificently, but they were being bled white by an enemy with what seemed like an endless supply of fresh troops. Then came the sound every defender had been dreading, the deep, rhythmic pounding of drums announcing the approach of the Janissaries. These were Mehmed's elite killers, the cream of the Ottoman military. They advanced in perfect formation, their distinctive white felt caps visible even at a distance, weapons gleaming in the morning sun. Unlike the wild charges of the bashibazoks or the steady advance of the Anatolian troops, the Janissaries moved with the confidence of warriors who had never tasted defeat. At their head rode Mehmed himself, close enough to the action to inspire his men but far enough back to command the battle. The young sultan's presence electrified his army. Here was their leader, their Caesar, sharing the danger with them. If the Janissaries could punch through now, Constantinople would fall within the hour. Giustiniani gathered his remaining reserves for what he knew would be the last stand. Maybe 3,000 men, all that remained of Constantinople's once proud army, stood ready to meet the flower of Ottoman might. The Genoese captain looked along the line of exhausted faces and saw in them the last hope of an empire that had endured for over a millennium. These men, many of them foreigners fighting for pay rather than patriotism, were all that stood between Mehmed and his destiny. The clash, when it came, was apocalyptic. Janissaries swarmed up the walls like ants, their scaling ladders seeming to sprout from every damaged section of the fortifications. The defenders met them with desperate fury, knowing this was their final chance. Sword clashed against sword, spear thrust against shield, and men died by the dozens in the narrow confines of the ramparts. In the thick of the carnage, Giustiniani seemed to lead a charmed life. Ottoman arrows whistled around him without finding their mark. Enemy blades turned aside from his armor as if guided by some unseen hand. His men took heart from their captain's apparent invincibility, fighting with renewed fire as they watched him cut down foe after foe. But then, in the space of a single heartbeat, everything changed. A crossbow bolt fired from somewhere in the chaos of battle found its mark. Giustiniani staggered, blood bloomed across his chest. His sword fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, The wound wasn't fatal, but in that instant of shock and agony, the Genoese captain made a choice that would echo through the ages. He turned from the walls and stumbled toward the gates, calling for his men to carry him to his ship. The effect was instant and catastrophic. Seeing their commander retreat, the Genoese soldiers abandoned their posts and followed him. A gap opened in defenses that had held for 55 days. Ottoman warriors poured through like floodwater through a broken dam. Emperor Constantine himself tried to rally the fleeing troops, but it was too late. The last Roman emperor died with sword in hand, fighting to the very end as his empire crumbled around him. So here's the question that historians have wrestled with for over 500 years. Was Giovanni Giustiniani a coward who betrayed an empire in its darkest hour? Or was he simply a mortal man who hit the absolute limit of human endurance and made a choice that any of us might have made in his place? The truth, like so many truths in history, lives somewhere between myth and reality. What can't be disputed is this. On that May morning in 1453, a single moment of human weakness opened the gates to a new world. It ended one age and began another in the space of a heartbeat. Constantinople fell. The Byzantine Empire, the last living echo of ancient Rome, vanished from the earth. And Giovanni Giustiniani sailed away into history, forever branded as either a tragic hero or the man who let an empire die. The line between heroism and betrayal is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, history turns not on grand strategies or divine intervention, but on one crossbow bolt, one wound, one human decision made in a moment of unbearable pain. That's the story of how Constantinople fell, not with a roar but with a retreat, not through overwhelming force alone, but through the breaking of one man's will at the exact wrong moment. And maybe that's the most human story of all.